I've found myself recently staying away from Genesis 1, even typically through 11, when I have conversations about creation. And I think part of the reason for that is that the whole Genesis 1 through 11 thing gets really, really blown out of proportion sometimes by those who subscribe to the view, but also by those who don't. And so I think what's really important is to go by what Jesus said as far as talking about the beginning of the creation. He made comments about the beginning of the creation. Mark 10:6 is a good example. He speaks about that as well in Matthew 19, and he speaks also about the historicity of Noah and the flood event, and specifically does so in the context of his return, which will, just as the flood was, be a worldwide, global event. All right? So, it appears that Jesus treated Genesis 1 through 11, as well as the rest of the Old Testament, as historical. He took it that way. But now what's really interesting is sometimes we come across this challenge, as it does relate to these first chapters of Genesis, that says that really it's just a polemic account, right? It's only meant to distinguish for the Israelites what kind of God they serve. Of course, Moses wrote that when they came out of Egyptian bondage. The Egyptians worshipped the sun and the moon and earth gods and water gods and fire gods. And of course, we know if you study into the plagues that took place as a result of Pharaoh hardening his heart, those plagues were actually representative of the Egyptian gods of the day, and it was the God of the Bible showing his power and demonstrating his power over those very same polytheistic gods that the Egyptians served. And so many argue that the early chapters of Genesis are not meant to convey any kind of historical, especially scientific information. They're just simply meant to distinguish the work of God from the work of these other false deities. And so the question that I'm posing here is does that polemic nature of the Genesis account, does that stand at contrast with the young age view? In other words, does positing and affirming that do anything to discredit the idea of a young universe? And the reason I'm posing this question is that many say that yes, it does. Many say that because Genesis is a polemic, therefore we need not take it as historical. And my contention is that let's grant that. Let's say, okay, well, maybe that's the case. That still doesn't change the fact that in the Ten Commandments, God treated those first 6 days as 6 24-hour days. All throughout the Old Testament, the first chapters of Genesis are treated just as historically as the whole rest of the book of Genesis, as well as the whole rest of the Old Testament. All the genealogies line up. There are certain connections there between chapters 12 through 50 or 51 of Genesis and chapters 1 through 11. There are connections there that should not be broken. When we go to the New Testament, we find Paul, all the other New Testament writers, and Jesus himself, most importantly, referencing this thing as history. So what I think we need to do is just step back a second and say, well, wait a minute. Yeah, sure, this could certainly be a polemic account, but that really has nothing to do with whether or not it's historical at all. As a matter of fact, I might actually drive the argument further and say that the reason we can have it as a polemic is because it is recording real history. My contention is that it's not just trying to tell us something about who God is, but it's also telling us something about what God has done. And the rest of the Bible writers seem to confirm this line of thinking. So when you're talking with somebody and they say, well, you know, John Walton and others have argued that Genesis is just this polemic, it was simply meant to distinguish the Hebrew culture from the other cultures around and the biblical God from the false deities of these other ancient Near Eastern cultures, you could say, okay, that's true. But on what basis is that true? Is it true on the fact that it records actual history? Is there a reason that the genealogies are the only two, Genesis 5 and 11, are the only two genealogies of antiquity that give us the kind of chronological information that we need? You can find more about that on my website, steveshram.com. Is there a reason that they give us the kind of information that we need in order to construct a chronology if we're not actually meant to do that? Is there a reason why why Jesus is treated as the last Adam, as in contrast to the first Adam? Is there a reason why Jesus affirms the historicity of the Noahic flood account? And not only that, but also the global scale of it. I think there is. And I think it's because, while yes, Genesis is certainly a polemic, that's a polemic that is based on true, factual history of how the God of the Bible created this world and created us, placed us in it, and began working and began his sustaining work on day 7 of the creation, and is sustaining it even till now, and will keep it in store until the day of judgment. Yes, it's a polemic, but it's a polemic based on real history.